Welcome to our event, the murder of Jamal Khoshoggi. How should the U.S. respond? Thank you all for coming on a somewhat cold and snowy day here in Denver. We're hoping that after the discussion we can sort of warm up the atmosphere here because it's a hot topic. Before we begin, our Center for Middle East Studies has published actually a new occasional paper on this topic. It's on our website. It's a transcript of a lecture that Jamal Khoshoggi gave earlier this year on the subject of democracy in the Arab world. Our center co-sponsored that event, and we thought that it would be an opportune time to sort of publish that lecture. So go to our website and download it if you're interested in the topic. I'm delighted to be here in conversation with Ambassador Gary Grappo, our Distinguished Fellow at the Center for Middle East Studies. Gary has had a long and distinguished career as a diplomat that has included postings to Nicaragua, Portugal, Jordan, Iraq, and Jerusalem. Gary was also the former Deputy Chief of Mission and Minister Counselor of the United States Mission in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, before being sworn in as the U.S. Ambassador to the Sultanate of Oman in 2006. So that makes him in many ways an ideal and perfect interlocutor for this particular event. Now, Gary, every time I read your resume and I come across the phrase former Deputy Chief of Mission and Minister Counselor of the U.S. Mission in Saudi Arabia, does that mean you were number 2 in command? Mm-hmm. Okay, number 2 in command in the Saudi mission. And what years were you there? 2003 to 2005. So we're incredibly lucky to have someone here at our university, here at our center, to help us talk about this this particular topic. I'm assuming that not everyone is following this story as closely as we are in the center. So before we sort of begin, I want to show a about 9-minute BBC clip that sort of updates you, provides some background context to this particular topic. After we show the clip, Gary and I will have a short conversation about key themes that are relevant to this topic, and then we will open it up to the audience. So let's start with the video, then we'll have the conversation. I look forward to hearing from all of you.
Jamal Khoshoggi walked into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul on the 2nd of October. The blurry images of his killers and their target have since been played countless times.
Yani girdi ve çıkmadı. Yani mesela ayrılma yok. İşte bir yere gittim ve yani bir netice yok. Yani insan ölse bile görmesi lazım inanması için.
The regime's critics say the order to kill can only have come from the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia himself, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, often known as MBS. The BBC has learned that the murder of Jamal Khoshoggi may not be the first killing alleged to have been carried out by his associates. In November 2017, the Saudi elite was gripped by panic. The Crown Prince ordered more than 200 princes, businessmen, and government officials to be detained at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Riyadh. It was described as an anti-corruption drive. The BBC interviewed Jamal Khoshoggi about the events.
The Saudi should give him the benefit of the doubt. But at the same time, shouldn't that be discussed in a consultative body? Yes, we need to crush corruption, but it is being done by one-man rule.
A key figure in the interrogations was this man, Saud al-Qahtani. 12 months later, the Saudis themselves would implicate him in the killing of Khashoggi. Now demoted, he was described as the Crown Prince's fixer and enforcer. During the interrogation of multi-billionaire Prince Al-Walid bin Talal, one of Al-Walid's business contacts was summoned to Riyadh. Al-Qahtani believed Alan Bandar could help persuade the prince to cooperate.
Saudi company was bragging about torturing those so-called royals. Quotation. That's what he. They are not real royals. That's what he said. He said we will treat them like dogs.
After almost 3 months' detention, Al-Walid was released. It's not clear what price he paid. Another detainee was treated more harshly, according to Mahmoud Rifat, a lawyer who has worked for several princes. He's also a long-standing critic of the Saudi regime. He says punishment was meted out to 66-year-old Prince Mit'ab bin Abdullah, former commander of the National Guard and Mohammed bin Salman's uncle. His is a singular account, but he has told us that several family members who were witnesses told him what happened.
سعود القحطاني ضرب عدة أمراء، ضرب عدة أثرياء أيضا. متعب أيضا نقل إلى المستشفى عدة مرات من آثار التعذيب والضرب، حتى أن محمد بن سلمان يعني بعد ذلك وضع مستشفى ميداني في الريتز لكي لا ينقل هؤلاء الأشخاص إلى المستشفيات بعد كل مرة.
A secret informant inside the kingdom has alleged to the BBC that the abuse didn't stop at torture. He says one man was beaten to death at the Ritz-Carlton. We can't independently verify his story, but it tallies with at least 2 other accounts of what took place. Using an encrypted messaging system, the source says the victim is this man, Major General Ali Al-Qahtani, a senior officer in the Saudi National Guard and an aide to one of the princes who had been detained.
لقد ضربه المحقق في وجهه بمضرب وسقط على الأرض. سكبوا عليه الماء ولكنه لم ينهض وتوقف قلبه. أحد حراس السجن أدلى بهذه المعلومات.
Mahmoud Rifat says he's heard about this killing from those close to General Al-Qahtani. He says the general's attackers believed he held damaging information about the crown prince and his circle. Rifat describes the secret information as a black box.
أظن أنه كان مقصود قتل هذا الرجل لأن هذا الرجل صندوق أسود لمراحل كثيرة، وهي أيضا الآن أحد الروايات التي يعني تظهر عن جمال خاشقجي أنه من أحد أو من أهم أسباب قتله هو فكرة أنه كان صندوقا أسود، وكمان هو الآخر بما مر به من مراحل مع أسرة آل سعود.
The Ritz-Carlton victims were all high-profile Saudis. It's alleged the attacks could only have been authorized at the highest level.
Saud al-Qahtani wouldn't dare to take such steps into a plan with this magnitude without direct order from MBS, and he only reports to MBS.
In the summer of 2018, an all-Saudi squad of 50 officers was created to target opponents both inside and outside the kingdom, according to a BBC source in Saudi Arabia who has a relative in the squad. They're known as the Tiger Team. The source also says that 15 men suspected of killing Khashoggi were part of this unit. Dr. Saad al-Faqih is a well-known critic of the Saudi leadership now living in London. He claims to know about the Tiger Team.
It was supposed to target and kill dissidents outside the country and inside the country. Outside the country, people in Canada, people in Europe, even in America. Dissidents inside the country, people who the regime does not want fuss to be made about their arrests.
What made Jamal Khoshoggi a candidate for assassination? As a respected international commentator, he first welcomed what Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman might bring to Saudi Arabia. By 2017, as he made clear to the BBC, he'd revised his opinion.
Today, it is ruled by only one man, not even within the family. He has no one close to him, even within the family. He is the sole leader of Saudi Arabia. One-man rule is always problematic, always end with a disaster, whether in Germany or in Iraq or in Saudi Arabia.
In the last 2 years of his life, Khashoggi became even more outspoken. On Twitter, he praised the Muslim Brotherhood, an organization banned in Saudi Arabia. And he was hired by the Washington Post to write about what he called the repressive and unbearable regime in Saudi Arabia. For these things, it seems he paid with his life. Riyadh has now accepted that the murder was premeditated. But who authorized it?
Anybody who takes a decision in the kingdom defers to MBS before they act. Is it conceivable that there could have been intelligence operatives, members of the security establishment who were trying to impress their master and miscalculated? Possibly.
Saudi Arabia has stated that the operation was carried out by a team acting without the knowledge or authorization of the royal court. they say Saud al-Qahtani was in charge of the team sent to Istanbul. The BBC has established that he has not been back to his office since the death of Khashoggi. Saudi media say Saud al-Qahtani has been fired, along with several other officials.
Sorumlularının, yapanların, emri verenlerin, bütün yani genel anlamda olaya bütün olarak baktığımız zaman elbette ki bir sorumlusu var. Yani emri veren kişi var. Yani emri veren kişiden uygulayanlara kadar herkesin biz yargılanmasını talep ediyoruz.
Saudi Arabia's recent actions have attracted massive global attention, most of it hostile. Ironically, Jamal Khashoggi's death has subjected the Saudi government and the man who runs it to the sort of scrutiny nothing he wrote could ever have achieved.
And you can see a longer version of that film on Our World on the BBC News channel on Saturday and Sunday evening at 9:30. The BBC asked Saud al-Qahtani for a response to our allegations and received no reply. The Saudi government has told the BBC its investigation into Khashoggi's death will be thorough, transparent and wide-ranging. Saudi law enforcement officials are working with their Turkish counterparts to uncover the facts, and a number of individuals are currently in custody. Saudi Arabia is establishing robust mechanisms to ensure that such an abhorrent incident can never be repeated. A committee chaired by HRH, the Crown Prince, will reform the General Intelligence Presidency. The BBC also asked the Crown Prince's office whether Mohammed bin Salman had ever sanctioned torture and killing. They said, "We categorically deny and reject these false claims, which are completely baseless and untrue." The Anti-Corruption Committee pursued its mandate in a responsible and judicious way. The law of criminal procedures guarantees defendants' rights and prohibits subjecting the detainees to any harm.
Okay, Gary, first question to you. Before we ask how the world should respond, how the U.S. should respond, how do you explain the ongoing fascination and interest in this story? It's over a month now. We're into month 2, and we're still talking about it. Yesterday, there was another editorial in the Washington Post. The World War I commemoration ceremony had news connected to this particular event. There's a lot of countries, unfortunately, that assassinate journalists and dissidents, and it doesn't generate this type of a global crisis. So how do you explain the broader interest and the fact that we're still talking about this event over a month now?
Good afternoon, everyone. Well, one of the reasons is for the very point that you just made, and that is that Jamal wrote for the Washington Post, one of the most prominent newspapers, certainly in this country and around the world. And similarly, other free media around the world are keeping this, or at least attempting to keep this, front and center, and rightly so. This is a direct threat to the free media around the world. If a country, any country, can send a hit squad to another country and assassinate journalists, then the free media is under assault, and I think certainly the Washington Post, but other media have recognized this. Secondly, there's certainly no question the importance that the United States attaches, particularly this administration, attaches to the relationship with Saudi Arabia. And so here we have the United States having had for actually decades a very close relationship with a country whose human rights record is somewhat less than sparkling, we might say. And all you have to do is read the State Department Human Rights Report, U.S. government agency, which is extremely critical and has every year been very critical of the human rights record, and now commits this truly detestable act of assassinating a foreign journalist in another country. So further blemishing an already pretty dark human rights record. And then thirdly, I think there's a question of Mohammed bin Salman himself. He holds more power than any leader in the history of Saudi Arabia since its founder, Abdulaziz Saud, who died in 1953. No Saudi leader has had the kind of power that he has today. And you can see it if you're in Saudi Arabia. You see it every day. But even outside Saudi Arabia, we read in the media, anything happening in Saudi Arabia stems from a decision he's made or something that he's authorized, which begs the question that the BBC clip asked and that everyone is asking, including certainly the media, that in a country that is so top-down, now more than ever, how could this have happened without the top having ordered it?
So how should the U.S. respond?
Well, I could say how I think they should respond. Whether we will or not is still questionable. It's important to note, and as I referred to earlier, that Mohammed bin Salman, and by the way, his father is the king. His father actually holds the power. But his father is in all likelihood indisposed. He has at least pre-dementia, and is probably not in a position to make the kind of decisions that a Saudi king is expected to make. And so his son effectively is the regent, the governing regent. And there have been cases of that happening previously in the history of Saudi Arabia. The previous king, King Abdullah, had been the regent. He was crown prince. He became regent when the then sitting king, King Fahd, was indisposed after a stroke. And so he effectively ruled the country as the crown prince and the regent for almost 10 years. In fact, he was the regent and crown prince when I served. And then Fahd died while I was there, and he became king. But even as the regent, he pretty much adhered to the style of governing in Saudi Arabia that had been followed by every king since Faisal in 1964, which was consensual. Those of you who maybe know a little bit about Saudi history know that there was a king in Saudi history that was removed, and that was King Saud, the oldest son of Abdulaziz. And he was removed precisely because he wasn't ruling by consensus. He was mismanaging the country's newfound wealth. The oil money was really beginning to pour in the late 50s and early 60s. And Faisal, who has always been considered probably one of the most brilliant kings that they've had, engineered an effective coup. And he did it by getting the Council of Ministers and, very interestingly, the clerics behind him. MBS has made sure that that cannot happen now. And he's done that because he now controls all the key instruments of power in the country. He controls the defense ministry. No Saudi king since Abdulaziz has ever run the defense ministry. That's been given to another king or another prince. He effectively controls the Ministry of Interior, which is the internal and external security services. He's chairman of the Economic and Development Council. He's chairman of the Foreign Affairs and National Security Council. He has appointed all of his officers in the armed forces and in the National Guard. The National Guard was always the strict province of the king. So in that sense, it may not be so unusual, other than the fact that he removed all the senior leadership. Prince Mitteb, that was referred to in the film, had been the previous commander of the National Guard. He was removed. And similarly, as I said, he appointed officers, including the heads of the Army and the Air Force in the armed forces. He has disbanded the Allegiance Council, which was set up as a vetting board for this consultative process that kings have followed. He's disbanded that. He's marginalized all the senior clerics. And, of course, he's antagonized the business community. He even runs the State Entertainment Commission. So he decides, I guess, what kind of rock concerts, wrestling matches, and whatever else they now allow in Saudi Arabia to take place. So the likelihood of a cabal forming inside Saudi Arabia is pretty much slim to none. So it comes down to either his father, the king, who I said is really not in a position to do it, or the United States. Because no relationship is more important to Saudi Arabia than the relationship with the United States. We have been their security backstop since 1945. And Saudi Arabia has always depended on the United States to be the unspoken security guarantor for the kingdom. And it remains that way today. And so if the king, even in his current mental state, were led to believe that that relationship was being jeopardized by the decisions of his son, then the calculus could change. But that's pretty much the only option I can see. There have been some reports that maybe some princes have been gathering, but without the instruments of power, it would be extremely difficult.
What options does the United States have here in terms of trying to deal with this crisis? I mean, there's one perspective that's out there that that goes as follows. We don't like what happened to Jamal. It's really ugly. There has to be accountability. But we don't want to destabilize Saudi Arabia by pushing too hard and too fast. And if we press for the removal of the crown prince, that could have much more deeper and negative consequences for all of us. And so from a U.S. foreign policy perspective, what options can the United States, realistically pursue, and what options really should they pursue to deal with this crisis?
Well, of course, foreign leaders ordering the assassination of opposition journalists or opponents in general is nothing new. Putin sent out 2 assassins to go after that former KGB officer who had been living in the UK. And Putin really suffered no consequences other than the condemnation of the Europeans and eventually the Americans. And we certainly want to be careful about succession in Saudi Arabia, particularly now when there's a real question about succession after the current king settled on his son, who then was 31 or 32 years old, to be the crown prince. There had already been 2 crown princes who had been removed. Mukrin, who was Salman's brother, so a son of Abdulaziz, and then Mohammed bin Nayef, who would have been the first grandson and was generally well respected and liked by the family and was considered to be the most appropriate grandson of Abdulaziz to finally become king. But he was removed in favor of his cousin. And so we need to be careful now because the line of succession has become quite discombobulated. There is one, shall we say, competent son of Abdulaziz who could rise to the throne, Prince Ahmed, who served as Deputy Minister of Interior for a long period of time. It's not an insignificant job because the Interior Ministry controls all the security services and also maintains communication and relationships with all the tribes in Saudi Arabia, which is extraordinarily important. And so he had certainly a hand in all of that and could potentially be a compromise candidate.
But the United States can't affect the line of succession, can they?
No, we can't. Yes and no. We probably would not go that far. But we would probably want to ensure that if we were going to insist that MBS step down or be removed, we would want to know who's stepping in to replace him. It's one thing to ask for something, and then it's something else to actually get it. And we have to be very, very careful of simply demanding, not that we would necessarily do that, demanding MBS be removed as crown prince. One mitigating option would be to have some of these roles that I mentioned earlier, defense minister, so on and so forth, be taken away from him. Many or all of them. Certainly the National Guard, the Defense Ministry, and the security services. it's also important to recall that he's been fairly popular in Saudi Arabia, especially for people under 40. He's lifted a lot of restrictions. As I said before, they had rock concerts, and I mean, I was serious. They've had WWE or F or whatever they call themselves now, wrestling matches, which they even allowed women to attend. Of course, they lifted the restriction on women driving, and he's actually promulgated some very positive economic reforms, and so it's kind of made him a bit popular among younger people who are very concerned about their future and the future of the kingdom. And so just willy-nilly dismissing MBS without paying attention to the potential reaction by the Saudi public is also a danger.
Do you see MBS surviving this crisis? I ask because now, given the media coverage, he's become sort of persona non grata, a pariah figure. I mean, if he shows up anytime soon in any major Western capital, there's going to be protests, right? So the question is, 3 months down the line, a year down the line, how do you see this playing itself out in terms of the relationship between this crown prince and major Western powers, including the United States?
We'll have to wait and see what his relationship will be with other Western countries. It's pretty clear that they're taking a much stronger position, certainly the UK, Germany, and France, than the United States has. I think in any previous administration, we would be taking the lead in being very strongly critical and maybe even taking some quiet action. I don't think that's likely to happen in this administration, and this administration will find some way to get along with him for one reason, or if only because this is not an administration that doesn't like autocrats. We know that. And MBS is nothing if he's not an autocrat. This is the most authoritarian ruler that Saudi Arabia has ever seen. And that's saying something in a country where the king really has so much power. And so I don't necessarily think that this administration is going to feel moved, with one possible exception. And I'd like to point this out. Whenever I talk about Saudi Arabia, and I've talked a lot about Saudi Arabia since my time there, and I've always been, by the way, a strong advocate of a close relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia for a whole variety of reasons. But I always ask the audience, how many people think the United States and how many people think Saudi Arabia is an ally of the United States? Man, that's kind of a typical show of hands. Yeah, one person. I mean, very, very few Americans look on Saudi Arabia as an ally. Now, when we think of allies, we think traditional allies, France, Canada, the UK. They certainly are not there. But they have been a close ally of the United States. And we have had an excellent relationship. We've worked together on some very important issues. And Saudi Arabia has, for the most part, has taken a deferential position with regard to the United States. They don't always do what we ask, but they always ask. And so I think going forward, we have to think about that relationship, particularly since this really seems to have gotten the attention of the American public in the way the only two other occasions I can think of when it comes to Saudi Arabia have been the oil shocks and 9/11. But there have been other occasions. Americans just don't think very highly of Saudi Arabia. And if you wonder about that, go back to 2016 when Congress passed the Justice Against Supporters of Terrorism Act, otherwise known as JASTA, which allowed American citizens to bring lawsuits against governments who were accused of supporting terrorists that may have taken the life of an American citizen. Now, the strongest opponent of that legislation was the government of Saudi Arabia, which spent a lot of money lobbying Congress not to pass this law. Well, Congress not only passed it, but they passed it over the veto of President Obama. Right. President Obama had felt that it crossed the line in terms of diplomatic protections and jurisdiction. But nevertheless, it easily passed over his veto, which I think is a very strong indication of how the American public, and therefore the Congress, feel about Saudi Arabia. And the suspicions many Americans still have about their involvement in 9/11, their involvement in supporting terrorism, and now this clear-cut case of having been responsible for the calculated assassination of an American. If that, or not of an American, but of a journalist, an American resident. If that continues and begins to impact the way the government, the way the American people view this administration's conduct of foreign policy, then that's a problem for the president, because he doesn't want to get crosswise with at least his base, but Americans in general, particularly with his re-election coming up in a couple of years. So that's a potential pressure point for this administration.
What about the role of Turkey? They're a big part of this story. And so I wanted to sort of draw you out on what you believe Erdogan's endgame here is in terms of his policy that keeps the story alive.
Well, I know that you've followed events in Turkey as well, Nader. First of all, we should dismiss any notion of noble aspirations on the part of Erdogan. He's one of the worst offenders of press freedom. He probably has 10,000 journalists locked up in his jails in Turkey. He's no defender of human rights or free press. He has an ongoing feud with Saudi Arabia in general, and specifically Mohammed bin Salman. And it's being played out in a number of places, one being Qatar. Many of you know that summer before last, MBS got this harebrained idea that he was going to force the Qataris to knuckle under and impose this blockade on Qatar. And he even got the support of the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. Bahrain really had no choice in the matter, given they have 1,000 Saudi troops on their soil right now. And he got a few other countries, Egypt and one other country. Turkey was one of the first countries that come to the support of Qatar. Turkey even dispatched some Turkish forces to Qatar itself and set up a small base virtually right next to the big American base in Qatar. There are claims, and I don't know how you feel, Nader, but I give some credence to these, that Erdogan has these neo-Ottoman aspirations in the Middle East, that with the decline of Egypt and the suspect leadership in Saudi Arabia, then leadership of the Muslim world should now revert back to Turkey, namely Erdogan. And so there's a game being played by Erdogan. And every time, at least when I follow this, and I see, okay, this is, it's been 2 or 3 days where I haven't seen a piece in major media, Turkey comes out with the release of another piece of information. Doesn't have to be headlines making, it just has to keep the issue alive, and that's what they're doing. The announcement just a few days ago that Turkey had released the audio of Jamal's torture and death to the intelligence services of Britain, France, Germany, and the United States. And Canada. And Canada, interestingly. Well, no, Canada's important now that Canada and Saudi Arabia. And of course, all these countries are known for strongly defending human rights and a free media. I suspect it may have been one of the reasons why the British foreign minister was in Riyadh yesterday. And they're saying that Pompeo may make another trip to Riyadh. So Erdogan is going to be very clever about this in keeping the pressure up. I don't think there's anything more he'd like to see than MBS out of his way.
No, I would agree with those observations on Turkey. One last sort of big, broad question before we turn it over to the audience. What are the bigger lessons here, the bigger takeaway sort of things that we can learn about U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East that flow from this particular crisis? And what I'm thinking of specifically is that, you know, this event, this crisis with MBS reminds me of another major crisis where the U.S. was completely shocked by the emergence of the crisis. We were sort of blindsided by the event that I'm thinking about, and I'll mention in a moment. And it seems to be a repeated pattern that we have here. Not long ago, there was another prince in the Middle East who became king, who was viewed with the same sort of admiration and hope that MBS, you know, that many Americans had toward MBS just a few months ago, when this prince who became king would come to the United States. They'd roll out the red carpet. He bought our weapons. He sold us oil. He was viewed at one time as a visionary, as a modernizer, as a, you know, a liberalizer, and then it all blew up in our face. And I'm talking about the Shah of Iran. I see distinct parallels, but I don't see any particular lessons that were learned with investing and, you know, anchoring U.S. foreign policy around one particular personality. And then when that personality just goes too far, and his entire, you know, kingdom sort of, you know, undergoes a revolution, then we're left struggling. Now, I'm not suggesting here that Saudi Arabia is in a pre-revolutionary state like Iran was 40 years ago, but I think there is an eerie parallel in terms of the consolidation of vast amounts of power in the hands of one person with a lot of wealth, in this case oil wealth at his disposal, who then pursues policies that come back to haunt him and his allies in the West, in this case the United States. So so the question really is, what's the broader sort of lessons here to learn from this particular crisis with MBS that might inform future U.S. foreign policy toward the region?
Well, relationships with any country in the Middle East is always problematic because, with the exception of Israel, which really is not even a part of this conversation, and possibly now Tunisia, you're always going to be dealing with leaders whose legitimacy is under question. And I say legitimacy, I mean popular legitimacy. King Abdullah in Jordan is generally pretty popular and pretty and well supported, but I mean he's a king. He didn't get there by popular vote, and no one in the Middle East, with the two exceptions that I mentioned, has, and no one will for a long time, most especially in the Gulf. So we're just stuck with having to deal with governments that don't measure up to our standard of governance. Nevertheless, we have to have relationships with these, and some of them, because of their importance, for whatever reason, whether it's oil or their geographic position or whatever, we have to have not only a relationship, but a good relationship, a strong relationship. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, we formed one that I thought, at least even through President Obama, although he had a very frosty relationship with the Saudi leadership, was consultative. That at all levels we would consult, that the Saudis would not act rashly, particularly when it involved the stability of the region, because that's an interest we shared, regional stability, and we still do, which is something worth keeping in mind. And so that's what we really need to keep our eye on, is what our interests are. And if we have to hold our nose and deal with less than democratic governments, well, we just have to. We have no choice. And in this particular case, however, I think particularly this administration has lost sight of the interests, even though they claim that's not so. The relationship we currently have with Saudi Arabia is based on the relationship that the president and his son-in-law have with the king and Mohammed bin Salman. Now, every Saudi king has had a relationship with every president, but not like this one. And when you lose sight of the national interests, and let's be honest, that's what our president is there to do, then he's not doing the job. And in this particular case with Saudi Arabia, we may be shortchanging ourselves, given the series of bad decisions this Crown Prince has made. The film clip referred to some of them. There have been a number of others. Most of you are well familiar with this disastrous war and horrific humanitarian crisis in Yemen, which was launched by him, Mohammed bin Salman. And so you have to wonder whether this is a leader whose judgment we can trust, because our interests are at stake. He has ruffled a lot of feathers. He's frayed a lot of nerves in this part of the world, including friends of ours. He has, I don't want to say they're destroyed yet, but they're certainly on the way. He has diminished the effectiveness of probably one of the only effective international organizations in the Middle East, and that's the Gulf Consultative Council, the Gulf Cooperation Council of the six countries in the Gulf. And so you really have to question this guy's judgment and whether this is the guy or maybe we should be looking for someone else to deal with.
Okay, great. Let's turn the floor over to the audience. Is there a microphone? We can pass my microphone around, and just raise your hands, and we'll try and get two questions here at the front.
Three-part. I was surprised about the ineptness of this assassination. In a lot of ways, it reminded me of Watergate in that it seems like it was not well thought out, it was not well executed, and it's now come back to haunt the Saudis. Does it strike you that that could have been intentional, so that if it did come out that MBS could have said, if I was running this, I would have done a better job? Or was it simply his not caring how it came out?
Well, I think when the president finally came out and sort of made an oblique criticism of this whole affair, and he did this rather belatedly, I think he was more criticizing that ineptness than the horrific act of the murder itself. You know, what a bunch of incompetent morons. Yeah, he got the worst cover-up ever, which kind of says it all. It was a cover-up, and I counted at one time there were 6 versions. I mean, they went from complete denial to, wait, you got these 15 guys coming in. Oh, no, they were tourists. Yeah, carrying a bone saw. Yes, it was incredibly inept, and I think it's also indicative of his poor judgment that he thought he could get away with it. You know, well, if we dispose of the body, then what's there to do? Yes, there's his grieving fiancée, but what's women in Turkey going to do? Well, I guess he forgot the Washington Post and the rest of the international media. So, yeah, it was truly bungled, and now he's going to lay the blame on his henchmen, and we'll see how that plays out.
Why do we care, we the U.S., whether or not Saudi Arabia kills Khashoggi? I mean, given all the other things that I can put on my list that are happening around the world that represent a real threat to this nation, why do we feel we have to do anything other than our desire to feel morally superior or some such thing?
I don't think it's a question of feeling morally superior. I think it's if the U.S. administration were to truly think it through the way they should, the first question they ask is, how does it impact the relationship, and how does it impact American interests? That's what they get paid to think. And the response is, this could be pretty significant. You've got one of the major newspapers in the United States who's got this bone in its teeth, and it's not letting go, and it won't. And the New York Times, the BBC, every major media in this country and around the world, certainly sort of the free world, is going to keep on this story. And as Nader said, MBS is going to find it very difficult to go anywhere without facing a firestorm of criticism for this act. And so that impacts the relationship, in fact, impacts our interests, and therefore we have to pay attention to it. The most recent example that I can think of now is when Putin allegedly ordered the assassination of that former KGB officer in the UK. We had already had a terrible relationship with Russia. Clearly was not going to get better. We already knew Putin did stuff like this. He's done it throughout his presidency. Does it impact the relationship? No. Does it impact our interests? No. We already know he has no regard for human rights, and so we can condemn it and do all these other things, pile on some more sanctions, and that's it. Saudi Arabia, it takes a little more consideration. Are we going to impose sanctions on one of the U.S.'s most important allies in the Middle East? Well, Congress seems to have its back up. Certainly when they come back in January, I think the House will get pretty exercised about this. So I think we have to care, and I think we have to take action, whatever that might be.
What was the rationale or pretext that Saudi Arabia used for the blockade of Qatar and then the war with Yemen, both which Trump and Kushner, of course, supported?
In Qatar, Qatar has always had always followed an independent track when it came to its foreign policy. So it had relationships with all sorts of organizations and individuals whom the Saudis don't like. In fact, we don't like them either. Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, and so forth. And so now no other country has gone that, in the GCC, has gone that far in carving out an independent foreign policy. The only other country you could potentially point to is Oman. They have not hosted Hezbollah or any of those in its territory, and they've been very careful and deliberate about the way they have cultivated their relationship with Iran. And so I think MBS thought that he could just make the Qataris buckle. You have a very young emir there, and so they imposed this blockade. He had countries line up behind him. Yemen, it was this visceral fear of and hatred toward Iran. Iran now has, of course, very strong influence in Iraq, which Iran had never had under Saddam. They had been very active. I say they. Iran had been very active in the Shia communities in both Kuwait and Bahrain. In Bahrain, the Shia are the majority of the population there. The ruling Khalifa family is Sunni. And then, of course, you have a very large Shia population in Saudi Arabia itself. It's about 1.5 million, 1.7 million, and it's all in the eastern province where all the oil is. And so to see the Iranians, or to suspect the Iranians are trying to capitalize on the instability in Yemen, and the Houthis, by the way, have always had an axe to grind with the leadership in Sana'a. It goes back decades. They could not accept the possibility of the Iranians messing at their back door. I once told the group of, I don't know, and some of you may have been here, when Abdulaziz, he is alleged shortly before he passed away, he told his older sons to always keep close to the United States and never turn your back on Yemen. And so Mohammed bin Salman decided to take that to heart, ignoring the actual genuine claims that the Houthis have against the leadership in Sana'a.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Does this incident have any impact on diplomatic protocol between the United States and Saudi Arabia, particularly with negotiations or with any type of dialogue that exists between the two countries?
That's a really good question, and it's something that is often ignored in diplomacy because from the outside, you know, we see something take place, and we think, well, okay, let's stop the presses. We need to address that problem. And what's often tried, what we try to do in diplomacy is compartmentalize these sorts of things. And the last thing you want is a single incident or issue to affect the broader relationship, which this particular incident has the risk of doing. But insofar as I know, it hasn't. But when the Secretary of State makes an urgent visit to Riyadh and now may be preparing to make a second one, then you have to worry. Because we and the Saudis have lots of irons in the fire when it comes to counterterrorism, economic cooperation in the region, certainly dealing with Iran. And so I'm sure the initial reaction is, okay, we're going to have to compartmentalize this. Let's get, you know, the right people on it, and we'll find a way to fix it. But we'll have to see whether, in fact, it is fixable. And it may not be. Going back to your question, Nader, the administration may find a way to just sweep this under the carpet and move on. I suspect the media and the American public, particularly the Congress, will not allow that to happen. They expect a pound of flesh from somebody, and we'll see where they get it.
So, in the same vein, I recently read that the United States or the Trump administration called for a ceasefire in Yemen, and I'm wondering how you see our government capitalizing on the recent pariah status of Saudi Arabia to get them to conform to, you know, our interests.
Another great question. I think it was more than coincidence when both Secretary Pompeo and Secretary Mattis gave the parties 30 days to come to the negotiating table. And then I think either Friday or over the weekend, the United States suspended air refueling operations of Saudi fighters attacking Yemen. And that's a big deal. That's a really big deal. And if the Saudis are reading it accurately and we're communicating to the Saudis, which without an ambassador in Riyadh will be difficult. I mean, the Sharjah can do it, but you want to really have an ambassador on the scene when you're facing a crisis like this. I truly think that we're building up to using this to pressure the Saudis to in this war. And it's unfair. The Houthis certainly have a share of the blame, without question. They've been guilty of some pretty terrible human rights abuses too. But if the Saudis stop bombing, a lot of innocent Yemenis are going to live. Moreover, if they stop the blockade, you're going to get humanitarian supplies in, and a lot of innocent people are not going to starve or die of cholera and some of the other diseases. And so that would be a wise use of this opportunity to pressure the Saudis. This is over. We're stopping, and you're going to find a way to negotiate this. I don't know whether that's our game plan or not. I would like to see it used in that way, and got a few other things that we need to raise with the Saudis too, because they acted really irresponsibly in this whole last year and a half, 2 years.
So at the beginning of the discussion, you said you knew what you would do to the Saudis, but you weren't sure the government would be. Could you enumerate exactly what you would do as a response to them?
Well, that also presumes having some knowledge, which I don't have. and that is, and I don't know whether the CIA has it or our allies, intelligence agencies have it, and that is what's happening inside the kingdom, particularly among the royal family, because this is putting Saudi Arabia in the worst possible light. They haven't seen anything like this since 9/11. And I don't mean to compare this to 9/11, but that's the PR nightmare the Saudis are in right now. And that could reach a point where it will affect Saudi businesses. I'm not talking about oil. And so putting some very strong pressure on the Saudis, particularly on MBS himself, at the very least, to give up these posts that he occupies in this government, to return this government to a more consensual form of government, the way all of his predecessors had done. I honestly don't think his father would have gone along with this scheme at all. His father was actually quite favorably viewed by the United States for many, many years. When I was there, we were sort of pining for the days when Salman would become king. This would be the time when Saudi Arabia would emerge from the darkness. They'd let women drive. They'd grant more press freedom, because he was a pretty forward-thinking guy. He had actually spent time in the United States. Of all the kings, he's the only one who spoke English reasonably well, but he can't do that now. And instead, we have his evil son, who's has the reins right now. I don't know that we would go as far is to force his resignation unless we had a pretty strong indication of who was in the batter's box and would step in, or in the on-deck circle. Thanks for helping with that metaphor. Because we've been down that road before, you want to be careful. But there are some very competent folks who could do that, particularly with the support of the family, which I think after MBS would not be hard to do. Just a question of whether we're willing to flex the muscle with the Saudis to do it.
Maybe two more questions, if there are any questions. There's one here at the front. Okay, and I have a final question, so I'll usurp that last opportunity.
Could you address the role or the significance of the arms sale agreement that the U.S. has with Saudi Arabia from the perspective of the U.S. and from the perspective of Saudi Arabia?
Thanks for asking that question, because it's really an important issue to raise. One of the reasons the president has asserted that we can't pressure the Saudis too much, because we have all of these pending arms sales to Saudi Arabia. We've been selling arms to Saudi Arabia for the last 40 decades. Virtually every weapons system in their inventory, if it's not American made, it's made by one of our NATO allies, which means it's NATO compliant. They don't, unless we're talking very basic weapons, they don't buy weapons usually from anyone else. And so all of their armed forces have been trained to operate American equipment. Their training, their doctrine, all their weapon systems are based on the United States. If the president thinks that they're just going to sever that right now and start buying Russian and Chinese, I got news for him. It's not going to happen. It would be a logistical nightmare, which the Saudis could not handle. They simply couldn't. They've got F-15s that are still on order, the latest, greatest version of the F-15. Any missile defense systems they're buying from the United States. All kinds of passive defense systems. They're command and control systems that exist in their armed forces and their National Guard. And we have large contingencies. It's mostly contractors who do it, but of our armed forces responsible for overseeing the training of all the armed forces. That's the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Special Forces, and the National Guard, which follows a different command structure. We have the U.S. Army that does that, and we have the U.S. Air Force that's in charge of the other training wing. Were you going to pack up all these folks, bring them home? And who's going to do that job now? So The president is wrong if he thinks that our defense sales are jeopardized by this. They're not at all. By the way, he's also wrong by saying that we depend so much on Saudi Arabia in our Iran policy. We do. There's no question about that. But there is one country that actually despises Iran more than Donald Trump, and it's Saudi Arabia. It truly is visceral, and it goes beyond just a strategic threat. You all know about the Sunni versus Shia. Saudi Arabia is not about to change its position on Iran. It won't change. And in fact, to maintain the hardline position Saudi Arabia has had on Iran, and in most especially MBS, he has to have the United States standing behind him. There is no way that he can take the aggressive posture he's been taking on Iran without the support of the United States. So he needs us more than we need him. We could still move full force on our sanctions on Iran and all the other things we want to do against Iran without Saudi Arabia. It would be somewhat problematic, but we could do it. We could do it. The Saudis don't have that luxury. They are joined to the hip with the United States. So it's really a false argument that the president has used in making the case for Saudi Arabia. But we do have interest there. And I don't know anyone would want to see us in any way harm that relationship. And we shouldn't allow MBS to do it either.
One more question. Do you know if Saudi Arabia is still exporting Wahhabism to the extent that they were a couple decades ago? Do you have any information on that?
Is it being exported? Yes. The way it might have been done, say, pre-9/11 or post-9/11, no. And I don't want to take up too much time, but I mean, 1979 was a watershed year for Saudi Arabia, and it truly changed the course of that country. Between the Iranian Revolution and the takeover of Iran by a theocracy, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and the taking of the Grand Mosque in Mecca, all happened in 1 year. And Saudi Arabia really doubled down on the one thing it was able to do to protect itself, and that was its religious faith, which is Wahhabist Islam, including in its education system, in its mosques, inculcating a very fundamentalist approach to Islam. They lost control. And I've had very senior Saudis admit this to my face. We never anticipated this would happen. It's out of our control now, and we do not know how to get the serpent back in the box, which is why I didn't mention it before, but we have extraordinarily close relationships between our intelligence services, too. You have independent Saudis who harbor extremist views and have money, and they are doubtlessly providing financial support, including to terrorist organizations like ISIS and a number of others, Boko Haram. We go down the list. And so that is still taking place. I don't think it takes place. I don't believe at all it takes place with the blessing of the Saudi government. I don't think it does. But the problem is that they've trained or helped train this coterie of fundamentalists, preachers and imams and so forth, who are now in many countries around the world, including in Africa and elsewhere in the Middle East and in South Asia and in the Philippines, virtually any place where there is a Muslim presence. And many of them come with a lot of money. They don't just build a mosque and assign this fundamentalist or extremist preacher. They'll build a mosque, and they'll build a hospital and a school right next to it. This is sort of the Saudi checkbook diplomacy. So that is still happening. I think it's much, much diminished from what it once was, simply because the Saudis got educated pretty quickly that this was a direct threat to them, particularly the Al Saud. Their 9/11 moment actually occurred in 2003, actually just a few months before I got there, and then it continued even more intensively after that. And even MBS has spoken up very, very strongly against extremism in Islam, and also the fact that it doesn't reflect Islam.